And the recording is in progress. So thank you very much, Jonas, and the organizers for being here. My name is Rob van Tulder. I will guide you through this session as one of the editors of the book. And the book, every year we launch at the EIBA conference, the book that is based upon some of the contribution of last year's conference. Of course, the last year conference was about the crisis, and it was a good reason also for us to then say, well, what does it mean, a crisis, and what does it mean also for the scholarship of the of EIBA? So maybe, Jonas, can I give you the floor, because I invited Jonas also as one of the editors of this book, of this to say something about what happened last year and why we are not going to a new book title, but first talk about international business in times of crisis. How did it go, Jonas?
Yeah, so also welcome from my side, and also welcome from the EIBA board here, to give you just a brief update on like the book that we have developed. You will learn more about this over the next 90 minutes. So what happened in the last year? In the last year, we originally intended to have a conference here in Madrid, and I think very abruptly in what was it? I think in July or June, decided that this is not going to be the case, that we have to move to a fully online mode. And that was something that, I mean, nobody expected up front. And at the same time, there were some volunteers needed to run the conference. And yeah, so we found two, it was Lucia and myself. So we created an online conference, and what you see today is really the output of this conference. One thing that I just want to highlight is that the attendance of the conference was actually quite exceptional. So if you look at the attendance numbers and also the membership numbers of EIBA in the last year, we had almost 580 participants in the online conference, which is actually more than we most probably will have here, and also more than we had before in the last live conference, right? So it was a big success on the one hand side, and on the other side, clearly for us at EIBA, seeing each other and seeing the social side and connecting in real life is something that is extremely important. And even though we are not fully there, I have to say that I'm very happy that we are able to meet at least some contributors of the book also in real life today, and all the others virtually here online, right? And maybe just to say this, also from the board perspective, for us, this whole PIBR volume and the whole PIBR edition is an important part of our publication portfolio. We are running this now since a number of years, and we have set this up newly together with Rob and Alain some years ago, and it became a very successful publication with a lot of issues and a lot of important topics. I had the great pleasure of being involved in 2 issues now, and I think I'm, with the exception of Rob and for sure Lucia and also Alain, most probably one of the few who has been associated with more than one publication as an editor. So I have to say that I enjoyed the experience very much, and I'm very happy about the outcome and what we see. So Rob, back to you.
Thanks, Jonas. You were, of course, one of the editors of the great book on distance. I think that is one of the best-selling PIBR volumes. So thank you again. So let's move on, because the book is now this year on crisis, and of course it was something that we basically said, well, we want to have a sort of an idea of what is IB, international business, and crisis. So we then figured out it would be good to look at sort of self-inflicted crisis, sectoral crisis, systems crisis, or even exogenous crisis as a sort of way of framing the narrative about crisis, and then also scientists about crisis. Exogenous crises are, of course, tsunamis, hurricanes, and all sorts of other climate disasters. But then Alain and I think we came to a brilliant idea also, because every year now for the last 6 or 7 years, we want to do it not just as a PIBR series, but also a tribute volume. And I think this was long overdue to give Geoffrey Jones also the credits to his long-standing work on international business and the historical perspective. So it was a very logical choice to do that, we think. Nevertheless, before I give the floor also to Geoffrey to give his keynote speech, because we're really happy that he didn't only want to contribute to the book, but also do a keynote speech. Let me give the floor to Alain to explain actually why we chose Geoffrey, not because of his good looks at the pictures, I suppose. Alain.
Thank you very much, Rob and Jonas. Dear friends and colleagues, in the introduction to volume 16 of the Progress in International Business Research series, we indeed explain why we selected Professor Geoffrey Jones, the Isidor Straus Professor of Business History at the Harvard Business School and the faculty chair of the school's Business History Initiative, to be the tributee of this particular volume. In the United States, just as is the case, I think, with other countries or regions of great business history scholarship around the world, every generation has one business historian who stands out and defines this generation. In the United States, this business historian has typically resided at the Harvard Business School. Professor Jones is, in the view of the editors, this one in a generation business historian. His lineage at the Harvard Business School includes names that all of us know and revere, including, and perhaps few people know that, Joseph Schumpeter and Alfred Chandler. Professor Jones was educated at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. Prior to working at Harvard, he was a professor of international business history at the economics department of the University of Reading. And I think that our friend Mark Casson, who is perhaps the most creative international business scholar of our era, had something to do with this appointment. We have been extraordinarily selective when inviting tributees for this series. Many of you will remember the 7 tributees who came before Professor Jones: Danny van den Bulke, Alan Rugman, Lou Wells, Rosalie Tung, Lorraine Eden, Peter Buckley, and Eleanor Westney. These scholars have, each in their own very special way, left an indelible mark on the field of international business and have truly inspired the generation that followed, including many of the authors contributing to this volume and many of the attendees of this session. Professor Jones is the exceptional scholar who has successfully straddled the interdisciplinary divide between business history and international business. He's the co-editor of the renowned Business History Review, published by Cambridge University Press, but he's best known for his incisive books on multinational enterprise activity. He has authored 12 of these books and then co-edited 28 other volumes. That is a total of 40 books and still counting. His book, Multinationals and Global Capitalism, published by Oxford University Press, is the standard textbook on the history of multinational enterprises, and it has been adopted at leading universities around the world. I should also mention Professor Jones' authorship of more than 100 Harvard Business School teaching cases and notes, which reflects an unusual and deep engagement with the practice of management. Professor Jones' oeuvre is all about the complexities of international business. Let me just give 3 short examples. One recent example includes analysis of the importance of oral histories to understand business trajectories. A second example is the study of the many difficulties associated with the greening of sustainability strategies, which cannot simply be imposed by third parties. And a third example, and perhaps the most important one, is Professor Jones calling attention to the roles of individual entrepreneurs and individual firms in the process of globalization. These entrepreneurs and firms have unambiguously demonstrated their almost unlimited wealth-creating capabilities, but they have also contributed, perhaps unintentionally, to considerable wealth disparities. As editors and on behalf of EIBA, we are very grateful to Professor Jones for having accepted our invitation to become the tributee of this volume and for contributing a chapter. I very much look forward to the keynote speech by this truly exceptional scholar. Thank you.
Thank you, Alain. So let me now move to the keynote speech of Geoffrey Jones. We agree that I click on the slide, so he will just say next slide, and I will try to keep up the pace. Geoffrey Jones, you're on. Unmute yourself, please.
Okay, next. Next.
Next. Oh, next. Sorry.
No, before that. The one before that.
This one. Ah, oh, this one.
Yeah. So I'd like to say I'm very flattered, very humbled by the invitation and Alain's generous words. So yeah, kind of made my day. The only problem was showing that photograph of me with a mustache in 1977. Which,
this one, sorry.
That one, which is a little bit embarrassing. Okay, next. And next.
Yes, okay.
So I thought I would like structure what I was going to say around the institutions and around the people who have influenced me, and mention as I'm going along what I've learned about crises along the way. Next. All right, so my story began with oil. I did a PhD on the British-owned oil industry before 1928. Britain had no oil, but British entrepreneurs went out to Russia, Iran, Mexico in search of it. And that was my story. And interestingly, this first story is where I first learned about the impact of crises, because before World War I, there was kind of like a linear sort of progress. Everything was going in one direction. And then World War I changed everything. There was expropriation, there's the Russian Revolution, breakup of the Ottoman Empire opened up Iraq for Western powers to carve up. It changed everything, changed the nature of the industry. And if you're seriously interested in crises, history is absolutely full of them. This is where I first met one of my great mentors. I had great teachers at Cambridge, but she wasn't in Cambridge, she was in Miami. And she's a lady called Mira Wilkins, who'd written 2 great volumes on the history of American multinationals. She wrote at a time when everybody else thought multinationals had no history. They all thought it had started after World War II. But she and I started talking, and interestingly, this was pre-web. So we corresponded by handwritten letters and telephone calls. But it was an amazing relationship we had of shared interests, and it's continued for the rest of my career. In fact, about a decade ago, she wrote the letter supporting my application to become a US citizen. So that's serious piece of mentorship going on. This was also my first and not last encounter with working in corporate archives. I started off by looking at government policies, but I always wanted to see what was on the other side. And once I started looking, I realized a number of things. The first was, it was a huge adventure. While government archives are like open to researchers, corporations control archives. So I had one interesting story after another. One company had its history being written, so they wouldn't let me in. All I got was a lot of free lunches. Shell had another story. I approached Shell in London, and they said, well, we'd love to help you, but sadly, all the good stuff is in Dutch in The Hague. And so I said, oh dear. And then I went away for 6 months, learned how to read basic Dutch, and came back to them. And they were so shocked by the episode that they let me into the archives in The Hague, which was kind of transformational for my work. So using business archives is a little bit like a detective. It's a little bit of negotiation skills to get into archives. And it's really thrilling while you do, because you can actually see how things actually happened, rather than just theorizing about what happened. Often it's eye-opening, it's always exciting, and you have this feeling that nobody else has seen that before. Next. So the second stage of my life was at London School of Economics. So I'd started off in history department at Cambridge. Economic history, I was introduced much more to thinking like a social scientist, was shaping how I was thinking about things. I continued to choose topics that were full of crises. A big study of a British bank in the Middle East was one crisis after, basically one crisis after another. This is the period too when I began to challenge the assumption that multinationals were primarily American enterprises, which at that time was very widespread. So I started looking back at European companies, and lo and behold, they had long histories too. Here I had more fun with archives. I'm the proud author of the one and only article on Dunlop, the tire company's multinational growth. And it's the one and only article because I talked myself into the archives, did this article, and then the company was taken over and they burnt all the archives. So I hope I got it right. And this was the period too when I started preaching that history and theory had something really important to say to each other. And luckily, other people were thinking on the same lines. And 1983, I brought people together in Florence, European University. Brought Mira Wilkins, I brought other European business historians, Mark Casson, John Conwell, John Dunning, all met to talk about history and theory of multinationals, which is something I've been going on about ever since. Next. So this relationship, this meeting had long-term consequences. I mean, it was in fact Mark Casson who recruited me to Reading, and there I landed in the middle of like so many epic figures in international business, Mark, John Dunning, and so on and so on. I also found, or we developed, a cohort of really, really good PhD students. Some worked with me, some worked with John Cantwell, some worked with Mark Casson. Many of them are still with us now as thought leaders in the profession. And that was very exciting and formative for me, working with them. By now I was hooked into services. I love services. There wasn't much written about them, which is one reason I loved it. And this is the period when I did these very long run, 150-year studies of whole populations of firms, first in multinational banking, then in multinational trading companies. Again, every type of crisis you could want, but by looking at populations of firms, I could also ask a new set of questions. I was particularly intrigued why some firms survive over decades or more than decades. Others fell by the wayside. And there were multiple answers to that, which I explored, but archival research was particularly important, I think, because it enabled me to look inside firms at organizational cultures and other factors which affected survival rates, something you could really only do by looking inside a firm, inside the archives. I love these companies too, because they were so diverse in corporate forms, not very different from like standardized classic American multinational, all sorts of networks, non-equity relationships going on. It was really a fascinating period. Next. And then 2002, I moved to Harvard. Here, new set of influencers. I hadn't lost Mira Wilkins. I hadn't lost Mark Casson. They continued to be highly influential with me, but I added a new set of guys. Al Changler was still there. Tom McCraw, another famous business historian. They were world-class scholars for sure, rigorous and everything else. Both of them interestingly had decided that looking globally and comparatively was the way to go. And this is the way I went once I'd arrived at Harvard. I'd been primarily a European or even a British specialist. Now I wanted to ask things in a global framework. I also met a new type of student, which was very important for me. MBAs wanted every class to mean something to them, to be relevant. So every single thing I taught, I had to sort of say, why is this relevant to you? And I was teaching some deep history stuff. And that really went into my research as well. I kept asking my question, why is this subject important? Why does it matter? And I think that's like a really good discipline. And it was in this mode I produced these books, which Alain mentioned, a survey book looking at waves of globalization, a book on beauty, when I was concerned to look not only at multinational growth in beauty, but what were the implications of the industry for how people define beautiness, being beautiful. And most recently, a book on sustainability, which is, as I wrote there, more or less the flip side of the growth of big business and multinationals. I spent a lot of time studying the growth of big business and multinationals, but these people were also eating the environment as they went along. So I wanted to look at the flip side. Next, and I've almost finished. New influences too, my friend in strategy, Tarun Khanna, and I started collaborating much more. I started publishing in the management journals, from JIBS to SMJ to Journal of Business Ethics recently, because I kind of thought history was too important to keep to historians. And we had to make it more dynamic. I found it challenging to talk beyond my discipline and incredibly important to do so, because one was constantly exposed to new types of insights, new types of literature. Next. Next, yep. Harvard too had the reputation and the resources to let me really expand my interest in oral history. Particularly, I launched the Creating Emerging Markets project, which has been doing lengthy interviews with top business leaders throughout emerging markets. And I and Tarun, who collaborated with me very much on this, felt that by creating such an archive of interviews, we could really create a new body of knowledge that could be used both in teaching and in research on emerging markets. And I was pleased to say when the pandemic hit, there was a huge surge in use of this, because it's sitting there free and available, and pretty high quality stuff about people who it's hard to find information about. Next. And needless to say, crises was a constant theme of what these people were talking about. And I found that particularly fascinating, because we're used to descriptions of businesses with viable, functioning institutions, more or less like stability. Here was a whole population of people who built businesses in conditions of institutional voids and with constant instability. And I think we have much to learn to studying these types of businesses. Last and foremost, last. So Rob and colleagues forced me to reflect on my life, which is not something I often do. And as I reflected, I thought so much how my institutional homes and my people I encountered shaped what I was doing. I think it's so important to listen and to learn from others. I think it's so important to listen and learn from people who are out of your specialized area, to be open to all disciplines. Because, I mean, that's where the innovation, that's where the new ideas are going to come, from not talking to people who talk your language, but talking to people who don't talk your language. And as I've said all the way through, I mean, any encounter with history over the last century or more, it's a story, it's no story at all of linearity. It's a story of constant crises. And it couldn't be more important to continue and to expand knowledge of the role of multinationals in crises, and to build some real theory about all of this. Because to end on a cheerful note, if there's one prediction I'm allowed, it's that the next couple of decades are going to see one hell of a lot of crises, because we've got them already. We've got inequality, we've got climate change, we've got the US and China seriously in danger of conflict. So that's a lot of crisis coming and a lot of opportunities to study what IB is going to react to it. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this honor. Thank you.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Normally we have a roaring applause, but I think that it's really great to hear. Also, I can advise everyone to look at the open access resource that Geoffrey has created. It's great with all the interviews. But this is what we do now next to the speech, is we invite a number of the authors to also to do a little pitch on what they did. So I'll guide you through the volume, because also the volume is freely available for everyone that is member of EIBA. At least I'm looking at Jonas, I think that still is the case. So it also means that what Geoffrey referred to were a number of names like Mark Casson, Myra Wilkins, Michael Witt, for instance, also. We invited them, of course, also to do a contribution. And we were really pleased also to see Myra Wilkins, for instance. She's now in her 90s, I think, still coming up with a very, very interesting story. So it is interesting to see already in this first part, and there will be no presentations on that, how these chapters also contribute to our common knowledge. And they all engage in not only talking about what Geoffrey has been doing, but also their story. And of course, Myra has been there forever, but Mark as well. So it is highly recommendable. I don't think, Geoffrey, you have seen the chapters, but they are worth reading for anyone that is here. So let us first go back. Also, let's go to part number 2. Maybe you remember we said we split up the book in 5 parts, 1 part on history, but then 4 parts on what we call then sort of the way to look at international business. And actually we did that because Geoffrey, in his paper, in a sort of pre-draft of the paper, said we need some conceptualization of crisis in order then to study also international business. So what we did was to create that sort of conceptual framework, very rough, and it starts with the micro perspective. And what we know also is that there's a lot of self-inflicted crisis, and that is something that you can see already. There are only 3 chapters here, because this is not something that is easy to study, or because no of the companies, of course, would like to talk about their self-inflicted crisis. By the way, read Geoffrey's paper on, for instance, how he dealt with Unilever, where the history of Unilever is also partly based on crisis and all sorts of other problems. And I think it took you 10 years to get the book manuscript actually published. So there's some interesting scholarly attention there. Now, I'm a little bit unsure, because I hope that Marcus or Mark is in the audience, and I have their slides, but I hope they can come to the fore and then present it, and I will push the button to click their presentation.
Yeah, Rob Mark is here. He will be here. Yeah, he's already here next to me. And I think what I would suggest is you say next, right? If you want the slide to be changed.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much.
There you go.
Thanks very much, Rob. Self-inflicted crises can damage firms' reputation and legitimacy. And when we look into academia right now advises the companies after a self-inflicted crisis to accept the responsibility for this crisis. Next. But looking into practice, we see different answers or different responses from the companies. Here we have Matthias Müller, former CEO of Volkswagen, who said, "We didn't lie, it was a mere technical problem caused by a few rogue engineers," referring to the Volkswagen Dieselgate. Next. Or the former CEO of BP, referring to the catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico, who evaluated it as a very modest environmental impact, what happened back then in 2010. Next. And we see also CEOs following the advice by academia, like the CEO from Takata, who said, "We offer our condolences to those who lost their lives and suffered injuries when they had a huge airbag scandal." But also the outcomes of these responses made us question, because Volkswagen, just 2 years after the Volkswagen Dieselgate was revealed, had their best year and they became the largest automobile manufacturer in terms of cars sold. Also, BP is financially back on track. They're still negatively associated with that catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico, but financially they're doing well. And Takata, they went bankrupt just shortly after the crisis happened. Next. So the question we are asking ourselves is, what is better? Apologize for a crisis and accepting the responsibility, or denying everything? Next. In our explorative study, we are drawing on attribution theory and the SCCT, which is the situational crisis communication theory developed by Coombs. And we examined 745 multinational enterprises from the 10 largest OECD countries. And we found 696 cases of self-inflicted crises in the period from 2009 to 2018. During the data collection, we of course classified the crises with two very objective conditions. So whether there was a breach of law and the law case was attached to this crisis or the company, or if a fine or settlement payment was done. And we then of course also classified the type of crisis. Next. Looking at our results, we see that M&Es often pursue a denial strategy independent from the type of crisis. So we have the crises, financial crises, product and service related crises, social and environmental related crises, and others that did not match this typology. And what we can see is that the denial strategy is in favor of most of the companies. And since these companies still existed when we were searching for the data, it also shows that these are quite successful with denying the responsibility for the crises that they committed. Looking at the international comparison, so to say, and looking into these 10 OECD countries, we also see some similarities, for example, in Canada and the United States. So there it's quite equal how often the denial strategy was followed or pursued, and compared to the diminish and rebuild strategy. And at the end, we of course contributed to the whole crisis literature and came up with a few ideas for future research, like for example, how successful are these crisis strategies actually? So one should definitely look into it and see how these strategies can be used to regain the legitimacy that is lost or other crucial resources from the stakeholders, or also what are the actually underlying factors which determine the differences between the countries. Are there some institutional differences? Is it culturally relevant? We'd be happy to see further research on that. And although I think you won't be able to find Homer Simpson in the book, I can assure you it's worth having a look at it. Thank you.
Yes, I was muted, so I'm back again, I hope. So that is part number one, self-inflicted crisis. You can see now the meso-level perspective, sectoral crisis. And what we chose then there was this whole idea that if you are part of a sector and as an individual multinational, you do something that might have spillover effects for the whole sector. Or the other way around, the sector that say BP then has a problem with the oil spill, that puts a sort of negative reputation to the whole sector. So this, starting from this perspective, there were a number of really great also inputs to this part of the book. You can see the names there, leverage digital FDI, COVID-19 crisis. Of course, we see a lot of COVID crisis around in every part of the book. But this one that was particularly also looked at in terms of location decision and the like, evolution of consumption and the like. But luckily, we also have now two presenters, I hope. Tia, who should be in the room, and say something about also study evidence on Estonia. And Helena, who's going with us online after Tia presenting something on her paper on consumer vulnerability. Tia, I have your slides on the screen, so you just have to tell me when to push the button.
Okay. So can you show the first one?
Yes.
Okay, so as you see, I focused on nonlinear internationalization before and during the pandemic. And I tried to find out which factors affected 3 Estonian firms' internationalization and how they responded to the pandemic and also what they learned from experience they got. Next, please. So, of course, I had a literature review part 2 in the paper where I told what kind of factors affect internationalization, especially exits and re-entries, also how crises affect internationalization and what firms can benefit from them too. But here I show the results. So it's a case study paper. I studied 3 companies. The first one was, or I would say still focused on construction panels and building various office buildings, hospitals, and residential buildings. So you see, actually, there were lots of fluctuations in its sales before the crisis, because orders have been unstable. It has exited some countries, it has re-entered some countries, and it has had lots of export fluctuations. But during COVID, of course, it had some additional problems because traveling restrictions. So in the beginning of this year, it was not possible for Estonian people to travel to Finland to work. And that caused lots of problems because they couldn't work on the buildings. So they had a choice, either stay in Finland for 6 months or come back to Estonia and never get back to Finland before summer. And then the second company is an alcohol producer. So it has had also lots of fluctuations. It has exited lots of countries before the crisis, but during the crisis, it had some positive impacts too, because there was huge demand for spirits, as it's a very important component for hand disinfectants. So it got huge orders, but at the same time, it had problems because restaurants couldn't order much due to restrictions. But still, it managed to re-enter some countries too. And the third company was, I would say, most vulnerable to the crisis, because it's a very small firm that is producing various leisure products, like handbags and key rings and belts and others. So it mainly depended on sales from its shop, but tourists couldn't come because of COVID. And also it depended a lot on trade from different trade fairs, but again, it was not possible to go there. So also before the crisis, you had lots of fluctuations in sales because tourists come and don't come every year. It depends how they do. But during the crisis, it was a huge problem for them. But they managed to launch an online shop and still managed to continue selling. And now, of course, it's possible to travel, but with certain restrictions. Okay, next, please. Next slide, please.
Yes.
Conclusions. So I tried to find out what happened. I found that there were lots of non-linearities in firms' internationalization before the crisis, but also during the crisis. And as you see, actually, this kind of phenomenon is normal. It's not something extraordinary for firms to exit markets and re-enter markets. It's going on all the time. But of course, it is evident during unstable times, like the COVID crisis. Next, please. And as you see, there were lots of impacts on these firms' internationalization. But at the same time, there were also some business opportunities, like increased demand for spirits for this alcohol producer. And also, as you see, they managed to learn actually a bit from the pandemics. They managed to do something online, especially the third company. Mm. And in a way, it's they're optimistic still, despite all the problems they have faced, and hopefully everything will go well next year too. So thanks. That's it.
Thank you, Tia. Let's move on to Elena. We are still in part 2 on the sectoral crisis. So Elena, can I give you the floor, and hopefully you can show your video?
Yes, so
that you can see. Yes, there you are.
Good afternoon. My name is Elena Sadmins, and I am one of the authors of the 15th chapter of this book, alongside Professors Marcelo Linardi, Susana Costa Silva, and Paulo Duarte. The title of this chapter is Consumer Vulnerability During COVID-19, and it studies the impact of fear and age on consumer behavior and business strategy. Next, please. So for such, we have investigated the effects of fear of COVID-19 and age on Portuguese and Brazilians' consumer vulnerability during pandemic scenarios. Doing so provided valuable insights to help companies design coping strategies when faced with pandemic market contexts, and hence supports firms in their preparation to address consumers' vulnerability in future international health crises. To operationalize it, a quantitative analysis enabled the assessment of the different impacts of COVID-19's pandemic on consumers' vulnerability. It did so through the adaptation of the Consumer Vulnerability Scale proposed by Xi in 2017, who measures consumer vulnerability in 7 different dimensions, them being the product knowledge, the product promotion, refund policies, marketing and emotional pressures, social pressures, distinguishability, and purchasability. Such results were studied against respondent scores on the fear of COVID-19 scale proposed by Ahorso sooner this year. Based on our Portuguese and Brazilian resident surveys, an age and country segmented analysis was then performed to understand the significant differences between the vulnerabilities of these 2 sample groups. Next, please. So our findings prove how the pandemic distinctively aggravates the vulnerability dimensions of consumers living in Portugal versus those in Brazil. Besides, the results also highlight significant differences in consumers' vulnerability during pandemics, given their age group. A positive correlation between age and fear of COVID-19 was also verified. And hence, these interesting significant differences identified between these 2 countries in study urge us to have a broader international look on this concept, as we see that one common context has proven to have very distinct implications on consumers around the globe. Next, please. So clearly, concluding this highlighted the need for health prevention measures to avoid neglecting existing vulnerable groups. And it even verifies how COVID-19 has managed to, unfortunately, proliferate consumers' vulnerability. Given such, we have drawn suggestions for both firms and governments based on our obtained results and existing literature. For example, knowing that young Brazilian consumers are more likely to, during a pandemic, become vulnerable to social pressures, strategies to avoid these vulnerabilities were put forward and discussed. Successfully implemented mitigation strategies were also highlighted, as was the case, for example, of the Italian government, who, aware of such vulnerabilities of its young population, used digital influencers to promote essential public health information. Having said this, undoubtedly, such reforms will enhance forthcoming societal and economic business advantages, and in this sense, the potential advantages for firms of shaping their activity according to their customers' current vulnerabilities during international pandemics have also been pointed. With this said, I hope you have the opportunity to have a look at this chapter as well as all remaining chapters, and thank you very much.
Obrigado, Elena. Okay, this terminates the presentation of part 3. You can already see that some of the themes that Geoffrey also presents in his overview paper, meaning internationalization is a non-linear effect, and there are all sorts of iterative processes going on. You can measure that at the company level, at the sector level, at the system level, and maybe on the topic level or whatever. So we have now part 4, where we basically look at the systems level and also including some of the country risk studies. We actually have now 3 presentations because I got just last minute notification that Rudolf Sinkovic is also with us. He's in the middle of a change from New Zealand to, I think, Scotland. He can explain that in a minute himself. But you can see here, chapter 18, we have a presentation. Chapter 19, we have a presentation by Jonas with a lot of slides. So I hope you are able to get through this. And then chapter 22, which it's interesting to see also what we call the paradox of distance. Maybe Rudolf can explain that, what that means for him personally also. So why don't we go to our host country risk dynamics and foreign direct investment by Jonas, I suppose. Jonas, for some of the co-authors.
Presenting, but it's actually going to be Thomas. So it's Thomas going to present the paper, who's just coming up on stage. So just to make sure that I'm not monopolizing the stage here, right? I'm happy to hand over to him. Thomas.
Thanks, Jonas. So this paper is a theory paper, and somewhat contrary to what Geoffrey outlined in the beginning, we actually do suggest that firms try to foresee the crisis and act accordingly when they make their internationalization decisions. And in this chapter, we suggest a way how this can work. So how we can use existing frameworks that firms use to assess future risk developments to incorporate the potential, at least for crisis, into the FDI decision. So Rob, given that there are so many slides, I'll say next, please, relatively frequently. So just to go through this quite quickly, the idea here is that we as humans like to predict the future based on our experiences from the past. So what we like to do is we take the trend leading up to today and project it into the future. Now, the difficulty with this is that sometimes it's really hard to do so. So sometimes the past has been so surprising that we don't really know how to make this prediction. This is essentially the point in this paper. We say that we should be considering the recent past when we try to predict what firms want to do in the near future. Next, please. So in this paper, we build on the notion of the discounted dividend model. So the idea that firms try to project future expected cash flows and discount them to today, and they do so accounting for the expected future risk. And the point we're making in this paper is that in order to account for the future potential risk, we need to look into the incidence of crisis or of dynamics, as we call it more generally in the paper, because this will influence how easy it is to project the past into the future. So in a sense, we are suggesting an addition to our run-of-the-mill capital asset pricing model, in order to incorporate the past unexpected developments into the understanding of what the future will bring. Next, please. And this is the quite specific, but the model that we derive from this, I think I've hopefully gotten the general picture across. So we say that as psychologists have told us, people like to predict the past trend into the future. So if, for example, we have political risk decreasing in the past when a firm makes a long-term investment decision, it will be assuming that this decrease in political risk will actually continue into the future. And that's why we have this proposition here that FDI probability will actually increase with a past trend in political risk that points towards a further risk reduction in the future. However, firms will have a hard time making such predictions when there has been a substantial dynamic development in the past, as it's called in this dynamism literature. And usually we conceptualize this across 3 dimensions: the predictability of the past political risk, the amplitude of the past political risk changes, and how often such changes occur. Now, this is of course an imperfect way of capturing crises, but it is at least a start. So we were hoping to make a first step into understanding how firms can predict the future occurrence of crisis and link it to the central IB variable of FDI probability. And then there's a final point here about firm size, which is essentially about the ability to stomach crises. So larger firms, and I think the examples we saw in the first chapter presentation by Marcus, they will have an easier time stomaching unexpected changes. So what we suggest here is that particularly the large and the high frequent crises are more easily absorbed by large firms. Next, please. I think actually that's the last slide. So essentially the idea here is to incorporate this idea of crisis into a prediction model, building on what is being used anyway. So we also have some hope to get this into some executive education at some point. Use the discounted dividend model, something that everybody in business practice uses, and adjust it for this tendency of projecting past developments into the future, considering also the unexpected deviations, because these unexpected deviations will make the prediction even more difficult. So there's some future outlooks. Actually, one of the things we've presented at this EIBA conference. So the idea to use some tools from standard analytics in order to make this nonlinear prediction in a more structured way. But I think that's something for a different time. So thanks a lot. That's it from my side.
Okay, thank you. I think there are, you're finished. I thought you had a lot of slides. So why additional materials you send me? You send me a lot of additional materials. So I will skip that if you don't mind. Let's go back to part 4, the table of content, because I skipped chapter 18, but I hope that one of the authors is there in the audience. Otherwise, we will go directly to chapter 22, because I don't have the slides. Is that Jonas? Can you help me here?
Right. So sorry, just 1 second. Is anyone here from chapter 18? No, Rob, I think.
Okay.
No one here from the chapter.
Okay, then we immediately go to Rudolf Sinkovic. Rudolf, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you. Do you hear me, Rob, everyone?
Yes, and I'm stop sharing my slides, so maybe you can show your slides.
Yeah.
Super.
Thank you. So thank you, Rob. I managed to arrive just in time. The chapter contribution that is in this part 4 that we proposed and we pushed towards finalization is called The Paradox of Distance. And we're talking about New Zealand businesses during COVID-19. This is a chapter which is collaborative work with colleagues from the University of Auckland. And so really the storyline that we are developing there is framed against a quite impactful book out of 1966 by Blainley, who goes through discussing the Australian historic development of Australia as a continent as something that is influenced by the Commonwealth, and by extension has made it quite big in using the terminology of the tyranny of distance, also in an economic and in IBA. Certainly, this is a very important dimension. Everybody talks about this also in New Zealand, which we have been recently working out of. So we are talking about dichotomies here, and we are building up the story around this tyranny of distance, which is in a sense quite interesting because New Zealand shares, of course, OECD, liberal market economy, and also an interesting facet of what is called the varieties of, or the happy variety of capitalism, which gives a slightly different notch and edge to the agenda that New Zealand has been pursuing over the course of this recent pandemic crisis, which is of course still going on. And our data, I should point out, is particularly pertaining to the first round of COVID and lockdown. Of course, we would now need to go out and look further into the implications that we have been experiencing effectively over the last 4-5 months in New Zealand. So I just escaped, in inverted commas, a 4-month lockdown that also, of course, also has psychological and other kinds of implications. So I bring this storyline up here. Also, you would see at the right edge of the slide the distance, the physical distance that we are frequently talking about in international business context. Of course, the antipode is paradoxically or notably to Auckland is in a small city or village, Centenil de las Bodegas. And this is, of course, in Spain. And this is, of course, something which has shaped the way in which New Zealand firms, and we are going particularly into a micro perspective or firm level perspective with our data, has been shaping the way in which exporters in the dairy context, for instance, or in the context of agri-food sectors have been engaging. So effectively engaging in day-to-day interactions, going abroad and interacting at trade fairs, and also interacting around meetings physically around the world. So that has changed dramatically, and we are using a case study approach. We are using it with a notion of pattern matching, which is something that has been developed by Noemi Sinkovic. This notion of what is the theory suggestion as to what is the literature suggesting regarding relationship building, partnering, and what do we actually see on the ground. And we are comparing this with a case study approach whereby we have 6 cases. And here you would just see how we go through. We are particularly interested in how this well-being agenda of the New Zealand government has kind of triggered specific responses with which SMEs are engaging in international business. So effectively, the curious, particularly curious thing is, while New Zealand is very well connected in terms of the digital infrastructure, exporters have not been very well connected in practical terms and not used to the engagement in a digital context. So the first nice story I think that comes out is that the geographical disadvantage of the tyrannous distance really morphed into a natural advantage, collectively speaking, for the country. There is a high level of social cohesion, certainly around the first lockdown and certainly around the first COVID crisis, which led to the willingness of the population and companies, firm partners to really sacrifice short-term productivity gains and short-term revenue streams in support of the New Zealand health and well-being agenda. And certainly they have been very strong and very successful in pushing that forward. Interestingly, also against prediction on a national level, the GDP decline was way smaller than in the rest of the world. So health and well-being pursuit in a nutshell does not come at the expense of economic well-being in the community. Small and mid-sized firms were actually quite well off, and as a consequence, that storyline that we would have been seeing in other countries, LME countries, is not has not percolated through in New Zealand. The interesting firm level results. This is the second bullet point that I'm offering here, is that because of this need for collaboration and solidarity and kindness, as Jacinta Ardern, of course, would be arguing in every single of her media statements, be kind is actually something that has been transmitted through the collaborations of partners and firms with the international partners. And the interesting thing is that there was an element of what we call forced digitalization. So firms did not choose to be more present and kind in the international space, but they did deliberately, in a sense, and this is what connects then very nicely to some of the storylines that we see in international business around the notion of, for instance, the virtuality trap. Everybody prepared very well. People and firms did not fall prey to sort of an over-exaggeration of digital media. They did very carefully utilize those to reach out and be connected. So overall, we see a very nice story contributing here, where the overall New Zealand agenda of benign kindness and willingness to spread and pursue the well-being of the country is actually percolated through to small firm companies, and they have been very successful internationally. Thank you.
Thanks, Rudolf. Good to see you also. Safely arrived in Scotland
Glasgow.
now? Glasgow, yes. I forgot, I skipped chapter 18. Mohammed he's there, but he was muted on his mic. So Mohammed, can I invite you also to come to the fore and share your slides with us, because I skipped them somewhere. So open your mic, please. Yes.
Should I, you have my slides, or should I share?
Please share your screen with us. We are still in part 4 of the book. Yes, there you go.
Should I share this?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. This chapter is basically belong to the examining the impacts of various modes of financing on investment in industrial assets, fiscal resources in public sector, and GDP growth in the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Basically, the issue was that it was a common opinion that because of the accelerated increase in external and corporate debts, there will be some problems. This study examined this hypothesis. COVID-19 pandemic has affected the different types of businesses in different ways. Due to pandemic, some time of businesses may be collapsed in near future, it was hypothesized, while some are being flourished. Due to these changes, the global ranking of countries in their economic growth and development may be changed. It depends on the growth and survival of their businesses in new post-pandemic environment. However, the sustainability of existing business and adopting the required procedures in the new scenario require the survival and continuity of business activities, which are closely related with the provision of financing to maintain their liquidity and working capital requirements. This hypothesis has been tested in this study, and which is based on an econometric model, consists of 3 simultaneous equations using 18 years data of 19 countries. The model has been presented through this flow chart. Our target variable was GDP growth, and in 3 equations, we took 2 other dependent variables, text to GDP ratio, which explain fiscal resources of the governments, and another dependent variable is investment in non-financial assets, how it can be affected by COVID-19 crisis. This flowchart established the linkages, and we hypothesized that growth depend on external short-term debts, text to GDP ratio, foreign direct investment, domestic credit to private sector, which is a monetary policy variable. While text to GDP ratio depend on the external expenditure or government expenditure and outstanding debts. We concluded on the basis of a panel least square method that based on the empirical evidences, we justify that use of bridge financing to support the economic and business activities during the economic depression and lockdown periods. The credit to private sector for this purpose can improve the fiscal position of a government, as it ensures the higher tax collection, it was noted that domestic credit to private sector positively affect the tax to GDP ratio. This relation may be based on the survival and perpetuity of business through credit financing facilities during difficult periods, which ultimately ensures the higher tax collection by the government. This may be an indicator of the association between financial liquidity and tax payments. Other conclusion was based on these observations that higher expenditures in public sector leads the collection of more taxes. If a government has to spend a higher amount of money, the more collection of taxes through discretionary efforts is likely, which is quite obvious. The external outstanding debt affect the tax to GDP ratio negatively. The tax collection efforts will be lesser in the presence of higher external borrowing. It shows less efforts for tax collection in presence of higher magnitude of external debts. Similarly, the collection of taxes will be lesser in the presence of higher magnitude of bribery and corruption in the economy. Empirical evidences show the negative association between credit financing and investment in non-financial industrial assets. All three components of credit financing, which consist of domestic credit to private sector, external outstanding debts, and short-term external debt. All these three affect the investment in non-financial assets negatively. It reconfirms the financial economics theories that firms prefer to finance their physical assets through equities, while the use of debt is a preferable option for temporary financial requirement. The negative impact of the tax to GDP ratio is expected. The higher taxes on business activities causes a slower growth in the economy. A study particularly discussed the member of CARIC and ECO Economic Cooperation Organization countries, which belong to Central Asia. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you, Mohammed. Can you unshare your screen? Then I can go back to my slides. Thanks for the improvisation also. Sorry for not seeing you. Could you unshare your slides?
Yes, I do it.
Okay. Well, we are in the final quarter of our presentation. Yes, I hope you can see the slides. So we move from part 4. Oh, now I have to get through all the slides of Jonas and his team. But we are in the final quarter of our presentation. And before we start to talk about next year's book, of course, there is a 5th part of the book. And it deals with natural disasters and emergencies. I can really only also advise you to have a look at Jennifer Utzel's and Chang-Ho Oi's paper. That is a key paper in that section. However, what I like about is that we finish the book with a story. And I hope I can invite also the writer of that story to say something about this. Adam.
Sorry, Rob.
Yes.
Rob, can you just, sorry, we cannot really see your full screen. So for whatever reason, we only see half of your screen.
Okay, let me try it again then. Is this working?
Yes, now it works, right?
Okay.
And I'm happy, yeah. So Adam, right? Happy to invite Adam on stage. Here he is.
Yes, finally, someone live.
Okay, so our case describes an example of an outlier who has taken an advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic. This example might be valuable because of a few reasons. First of all, our entrepreneur who is operating in the tourist industry, maybe next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Who is operating in a tourist industry is functioning in a very distant market. That differs in terms of almost all dimensions from his country of origin, so from Poland to the Zanzibar when he is operating. that dimensions might be described by cage framework, Gamma-Watt's cage framework. And moreover, most countries introduced severe traveling restrictions. And as a result, the tourist industry was hit particularly hard by this pandemic. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. But what makes the case particularly valuable is the fact that our protagonists not only managed to cope with the distance and survive the first wave of the crisis, but also took an advantage of it. He treated the turbulence as a source of opportunities. We argue that he could have managed to survive and expand because of being embedded in two contexts, which allowed him to show Zanzibar as a safe land and, let's say, differentiate his offer. That move can be described as distance leveraging. We have tested this case study during international business classes at our faculty of University of Warsaw. And we suggest this material for exercising topics of distance management with application of Gamma-Watt's cage framework, as well as entrepreneurial resilience factors. It consists of two parts. The first one describes the topic of distance management, and the second one describes the topic of entrepreneurial resilience. And you are free to choose whether you want to use only the first part of or both of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we are entering into the last 13 minutes of our session. And I hope that the next editors will also be present. And I'm not sure because I invited also the publisher. I have to look at Jonas. I don't think the publisher is there, is he, Jonas? Emerald, our esteemed publisher also that has a joint venture with EIBA.
Not sure if the microphone is on. No, but no, I think we do not have the publisher here. No.
Okay, well, then let's move on to next year's book, because this is a running gag every time we do the presentation of the book, and the book will be released. This book on international business in the crisis. It should have been available now, but the shortage of paper, and maybe you've seen some of the problems in the supply chain also stalled progress a little bit there. But it will be available. All the papers are available already, but the book will be available in a couple of months, I'm sure. I would have hoped that Emerald would say that to you all, but unfortunately I have to do it myself. So the invitation now is to the next book. Every year we take the conference theme and then build the book around that. And with Elisa and Isabel, I'm going to do the editing of next year's book, International Business and Sustainable Development Goals in the post-pandemic era. You can see already how optimistic we are, that we think there might be a post-pandemic era. So can I invite either Isabel or Elisa? I think both of them wanted to be in the room. So why don't they come to the fore, and then I'll give a short introduction on the sort of table of content, and they can give their own ideas on how they would like to support this. Are they there, Jonas?
Isabel is here, and she's just coming on stage.
Super.
So hi, Rob.
Hi,
thank you. Yes, well, I'm very pleasure to share with Rob and Elisa this new volume, the volume number 17, and in close connection with the conference, we would like to link international business and sustainable development goals in the post-pandemic era, as optimistically Rob has mentioned before. And we invite to submit your proposals before or by January 2022. And there are several angles to see to this particular relationship of international business and sustainable development goals. One of them is the diverse strategic let's say, strategic objectives of multinational companies. We would also like to see, and we expect proposals on SDG washing, the several washing mechanisms, if we like. There are some expected chapters on Sustainable Development Goals Nexus, as well as with partnering. And there is also something which connect with practitioners and policies in terms of the alignment with national agendas, because both, I mean, multinationals, SMEs, and also the public-private partnerships has something to tell us. So we would expect literature review, case studies, and different proposals coming both from this conference first, but also from other contribution, not necessarily from the conference itself. And that's all. I mean, Rob, if you want, of course, there is a deadline for the proposals, which is January 20th. And you can send us either to Rob, to Elisa, or myself on that particular date. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and the further explanation of the procedure, of the sort of content, a little bit of the occasion, some background information is in EIBA zine. I hope you can read that. And we really would like to invite anyone. Again, this is a book project where you can submit a paper that you already submitted here and then do a version of this in the book. Case studies, systematic literature reviews, they're all invited. Of course, we will check some of the quality, but this is the nice part of why Alain and I say, and now I can tell you, 10 years ago, we started our editorship of the PIBR series. And every year we are sort of progressing with the idea that how important it is to have a book. And not just a few papers of the conference, but also inviting other writers. And you can have seen also with Geoffrey Jones now as the invited, the tribute volume. Then you can see a lot of other authors that didn't participate maybe in the EIBA conference, but nevertheless want to contribute. So we keep that system moving, and I hope that it also is appealing to everyone, because the book, again, this year's book, and I am sure that next year's book will be as great as this year, because in this area we can see a lot of new sort of authors appearing. There is a special issue of the Journal of International Business Policy. There's a special issue on SDGs by the Journal of Business Ethics, but there's also a special issue of the Journal of the Critical Perspective in International Business. Rudolph is the editor there. So you can see already there's a lot of attention, which means also a lot of people are now looking at this. So this is one of the aims of that book project, to bring a number of these papers together even before it even gets published in top journals. So the procedure is there to invite you. Please contact us also. We are welcoming any kind of ideas, but there is a strict deadline. You can see also, because next year in the conference in Oslo, we really hope that now we can have the physical book there. And then that means also that by 15th of May, your full manuscript should be finished. So, but please notify us as soon as you can. So that, I think that terminates Isabel. I don't think we need to explain anything else. I hope you and Elisa, while being at the conference, will also try to pick out people to stimulate them to become to contribute to the book. So this is my final slide. I'm looking at Isabel and Jonas now. Maybe you have some final words on this. And before I just say also, it was a great pleasure again in this book with Geoff Jones and all the other authors. But of course, my biggest pleasure was to work together with Jonas, Lucia, and in particular with Alain, who I've been working together for the last 10 years on the book series. And it's a pleasure also to work with everyone. And hopefully next year we will be there physically again. Thank you. Jonas.
Great. Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you very much, Rob. Again, from my side, thank you for all the contributions of all the authors. Thank you for also Isabel's new book, right? We are very much looking forward to this. And yeah, we are really looking forward to meet in person again, also hopefully next year in a post-pandemic era, right? Yeah, so thank you very much to everyone. I hope you enjoyed the session and do not hesitate to contribute to the new book. Isabel will be happy to discuss your proposals. Yeah, so all the best, Rob, and all the best to everyone online all over the world. So my best wishes to everyone contributing. Bye-bye, and everyone here, see you tomorrow at the conference, 8:30.